and ceremony in Beijing as China and Brazil agree to strengthen bilateral ties. Hello, I'm Einar and this is The Heat. Brazilian President Lula da Silva says he wants to work with Beijing to balance world geopolitics and help reinvigorate the South American nation's ailing industrial sector. The Brazilian leader has spent 4 days in China, meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping on Friday in Beijing, where more than a dozen new agreements were signed. CGTN's Fang Yilei has more in this report.
Well, the high-level talks between the presidents from China and Brazil took center stage during the bilateral meetings today. And these discussions have created hope for a renewed and stronger partnership between China and Brazil. Chinese President Xi Jinping stated that China is committed to developing its relationship with Brazil from a long-term and strategic perspective and prioritizes the relationship in its diplomacy. And Brazilian President Lula echoed that and mentioned to establish a just and reasonable international order. The two leaders issued a joint statement on deepening the comprehensive strategic partnership between China and Brazil. On the Ukraine crisis, both sides agreed that the dialogue and negotiation are the only viable solutions to the crisis, and they called on more countries to play a constructive role in promoting a political solution. The meeting also highlighted the significance of enhancing pragmatic collaboration and consistently progressing existing major projects. Xi emphasized that China's modernization will offer opportunities for countries like Brazil, and China welcomed more high-quality Brazilian products to enter the Chinese market. Both nations have committed to exploring the potential for cooperation in agriculture, energy, infrastructure, aerospace, science and technological innovation, and strengthen cooperation in green economy, digital economy, and clean energy. After the talks, the two leaders witnessed the signing of bilateral cooperation documents in some of these areas. And President Xi Jinping also emphasized that China firmly supports Latin American and Caribbean countries in consolidating peace, stability, independence, and united development, and supports the region in advancing the integration process and playing a greater role in international affairs. The visiting Brazilian president also met with China's Premier Li Qiang and Zhao Leji, chairman of the Standing Committee of the Chinese Top Legislature. Premier Li said China is willing to deepen political mutual trust, strengthen the alignment of development strategies, create new highlights in economic and trade cooperation. And Zhao Leji said China's top legislature aims to actively exchange governance and legislative experiences with the Brazilian Congress. Feng Yilei, CGTN, Beijing.
There's much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Gong is an economics professor at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. Paulo Sotero is a distinguished fellow and the former director of the Wilson Center's Brazil Institute. Also with us is Einar Tangen. He's the founder and chair of Asia Narratives and a senior fellow at China's Taihe Institute. And Gustavo Ribeiro is the founder and editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Gustavo, this is a very high-profile visit by the Brazilian leader to China. He spent 4 days in the country. Before he left Brazil, he set out his key objectives in an interview with CGTN's Wang Guan. Let's listen to what he said.
My visit to China this year has multiple meanings. First of all, we hope to establish a long-term strategic partnership with China. Secondly, we need to further deepen the relationship between the two countries, not only in the field of economy and trade, but also to deepen the cooperation in science and technology between the two countries. What's more, we hope to strengthen cooperation between universities of the two countries and let more Chinese students study in Brazil and more Brazilian students study in China. We need policies that make China a strategic investment partner for Brazil.
So, Gustavo, listening to the president there, those are pretty expansive goals. How significant is this visit in terms of strengthening the relationship between the two countries?
Well, I think Lula wanted to set a different tone to Brazil-China relations as opposed to the 4 years of Jair Bolsonaro, where these relations were fraught at times. We have to remember that Bolsonaro was highly critical of China. He spread misinformation around China and COVID. and many of his cabinet ministers and family members spoke of China with racist terms. So now Lula tries to make relations closer, less tense. China is Brazil's outright trading partner, so this is a relationship of extremely significance, and it also goes in line with Lula's geopolitical goals. He wants a world that is less U.S.-centric. In that regard, Brazil under Lula and China have goals that align with each other in terms of geopolitics.
Gustavo, you say he wanted to change the tone in the relationship from that with the previous president, Jair Bolsonaro. I mean, we did see that tone has changed significantly. Was this something of a reset in the relationship?
That's what the Brazilian government is talking about this visit. The Brazilian government says, quote, the rebirth of Brazil-Chinese relations, and it's part of a broader plan of Lula of making Brazil have a bigger role in international relations. Brazil was often viewed as a pariah on the global scene, especially because of Jair Bolsonaro's sometimes crass ways, and also mainly because of his environmental policies or lack thereof.
Einar, Tangen, Brazil, of course, wants more Chinese investment in the country, and we've seen how this relationship economically has grown since the beginning of the 2000s to where it is now. China is already Brazil's largest trade partner. Bilateral trade between these two countries amounted to $171.5 billion last year. Where do you see this going now? Where is the potential for expansion in the relationship?
Well, from Lula's point of view, it would be reindustrialization. He realizes that China is climbing into a tertiary economy, and as a result, that leaves room for places like Brazil, as has been done in other places in the Belt and Road, to downstream a tremendous amount of industrialization. A lot of U.S. companies have left over a 30-year period, literally. Brazil's industrialization as a percent of GDP has halved, and he would like, as a former steel worker, to see that reversed. I mean, Brazil has so many natural reserves. The idea is that he would like to have more value created within the country, through industrialization, refining the steel, etc., before it's shipped out, so they can earn more money and create more jobs.
Paulo, Sotero, if we look at the broader implications of this visit by President Lula to China, I mean, Brazil and China, they signed a number of agreements on renewable energy, agribusiness, information technology, health and infrastructure. But there are some analysts who look at this close relationship between the two countries, and they say that this relationship is growing at the expense of the United States. Others say that Brazil is merely being very pragmatic here. It's not favoring one side at the expense of the other. What do you think?
I believe that is basically correct, although there are elements in Brazil that have a chip on the shoulder when it comes to relationship with the United States. There is an ideological reading of the relationship with the United States, and less so in terms of China. For Brazil, the challenge that China getting closer to China poses is to overcome the obstacles that exist in Brazil, not because of the United States, not because of China, to overcome the limits that Brazil faces to improve the quality of its growth. Because in the way we have been going in the past 10 years, when the economy in Brazil has been basically paralyzed, we are not going to be able to do much to benefit from the opportunities that a closer relations with China offers. So that, I would say, is the challenge for Brazil to get closer and more consequential with China and with other countries. Those challenges are in Brazil. They are not in this dialogue.
Paulo, there was a very sharp focus on the part of President Lula on reindustrialization, as it was put during these meetings. And of course, they signed a number of agreements, as I said, 4 days of meetings. Did he get what he wanted?
Yes, some agreements go in that direction, but Anand, the key here is implementation. And he goes back to Brazil and he faces the business community that has a tradition of being very protectionist of its interests, has working class workers that have similar protectionist inclinations for good reasons, and in a situation where there is much less room to maneuver and to fail than in the past. The Brazilian economy has qualitatively gone backwards. So for Lula, it is quite a challenge.
John Gong, one other development which is being looked at very closely by the developing world was President Lula making a very strong push for developing countries to move away from the dollar in international trade. In fact, during the visit, he posed the question. He said, who was it that decided the dollar was the currency after the disappearance of the gold standard? Now, look, realistically, I don't think the dollar is about to be replaced by any other currency as the world's reserved currency, or a basket of currencies for that matter. But how significant is this effort by President Lula to what's being called de-dollarize?
Yeah, well, I think his call for an alternative currency, not to replace, but at least to play a more prominent role in international trade, it is, in my view, part of a ideological inclination that the previous panel has been talking about. This is very typical, in my view, it's very typical Latin America left-wing, politics going on over there. And I think also on top of this, also the painful lesson of Brazilian's economy, being basically victimized by too much reliance on the U.S. dollar for the past few decades. Brazilian economy has been several times actually got into big troubles because of the overextension of external debt denominated in U.S. dollar. Every time interest rate goes up in the United States, there's a big crisis in Brazil. So this is a natural outcome of both the economic reality in Brazil as well as his ideological inclination, in my view. But having said that, I think there's a legitimate reason at this point. There's also the time is about right, actually, at this point, that the world, the global south, for example, the developing world is indeed looking for an alternative to the dollar dominated order. This is because many countries have been painfully seeing how dollar is actually to some extent causing their economic problems at this time, and also how dollar has been used as it's been weaponized basically as a sanctioning vehicle. There's a video script put out by a U.S. Senator from Florida, Marco Rubio, talking about commenting on Lula's statement about the U.S. dollar. Immediately, he was talking about the United States, it's losing ability to impose sanctions. That's what he was talking about. So you can see the kind of a mindset on some politicians in the United States. Their view about the U.S. dollar, it is very much tied to a sort of hegemonic view of the world. And this is precisely what he's coming from. I think it's, both from a political as well as from economic considerations, it's time to think about an alternative currency here.
Gustavo, President Lula also wants to reposition Brazil's role in the world after 4 years of relative isolation under the previous president, Jair Bolsonaro. If we look at Brazil right now, it's one of the key members of BRICS, which is that grouping of developing countries. It's also in the G20. And this, of course, this visit and these discussions are taking place under the banner of a comprehensive strategic relationship. What do you believe is the strategic importance of the relationship between Brazil and China?
Well, China is one of the world's top 2 superpowers, and Lula has this ideology of non-alignment with the U.S., so it is a relationship that is of greatly importance. If I may just add to the point of replacing the dollar as the currency for trade, Brazil and China did sign on January 31st an agreement, and China named an offshore clearing bank in Brazil to facilitate trade in RMB and reais. So that rhetoric from Lula is already part of actions between the 2 countries to facilitate trade in their currencies. And what we have talked also with diplomatic sources from several countries here in Brazil is that while there is an understanding that China is an extremely important actor for Brazil, a partner, there has been some worries in some Western countries that Lula's rhetoric in this visit and in previous weeks has had some undertones that are concerning for Western powers, with a lot of jabs at Washington, some veiled, some not so veiled. So Brazil tries to position itself as a neutral party that wants to have deep relationships with every partner that may be interesting to Brazil. But the way he's doing so is also sending messages that even if Lula may want to be close to the U.S., he wants to be closer to the BRICS.
Einar Tangen, what are your thoughts on this strategic relationship between Brazil and China?
Well, Anna, it's clearly a much larger picture than that. This is about BRICS, and when you start talking about BRICS, it's really about the developing and emerging economies throughout the world have a very, very different worldview. I mean, this is part of this multi-polar world that is emerging. And quite frankly, I mean, China said, look, we'll support Brazil's a place on the Security Council. Obviously, this new development bank having Dilma Rousseff named to it, talking about economic development outside the U.S. Now, remember, you know, the visit that Lula had with Biden a while back was not very productive. A lot of talk, but there's been absolutely no action. So a lot of these jibes at Washington are aimed at saying, look, you know, we gave you a chance and you delivered nothing. Here we are in China and we're getting all sorts of things. One of the things that was close to some people in Brazil was this allowing more meat to come in, which was an issue of having more meat processing things. Now that's been done. There's also a satellite deal. He talked to BYD. But it really signals beyond what Brazil wants to this kind of greater BRICS role, which is expanding, even as the U.S. kind of, you know, perception of the U.S. within the developing and emerging world is going down. Actually, China, according to a Cambridge study that was just recently concluded, said for the first time, China is actually ahead of the United States in the developing and emerging world.
Paulo, Sotero, talking about the strategic partnership, especially in the context of what is going on in the world right now, President Lula said that he would like to join China in setting up something like a group of nations to seek peace in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, a so-called peace club to mediate peace. Now, the United States, which is the main arms supplier to Ukraine as well as its main financier, is not keen on any kind of ceasefire right now, saying that a ceasefire right now would give a strategic advantage to Russia in its territorial gains that it's made in Ukraine. But do you think President Lula's plan for some kind of peace club, as it's being called, will gain some kind of traction?
It may, but it doesn't look like it right now, simply because Brazil has not much to offer beyond its goodwill. Brazil has always been a proponent of peace, It has been member of every important international global agreement, regional member of the founding member of the UN, but going towards that, what Lula and Brazil has always been looking for in one is being recognized for a role of leadership. When Brazilian voice will be heard, etc. Now, Brazil has to detail much more what it wants to do with its leadership. There was, for instance, an episode, some of you may remember, in 2010, when Brazil offered to try to mediate, to facilitate a nuclear agreement between the permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany with Iran. That effort ended very, very badly and left a lot of sour taste in the relationship, not only between Brazil and Iran and the United States, but also with China and Russia at the time, who imposed the approved sanctions against Iran that Brazil had to impose. I think that Brazil has to be more careful about all of this and decide in advance. This is not a competition for vanity. This has to result in concrete political and economic and diplomatic advantages to Brazil, and that's how it's going to be judged by the Brazilian population. Although Brazilians are less versed in this sort of topic beyond its diplomats, the circles of journalists, etc. This is what matters, and I think that the president has to be very careful in the way, and he knows that, and he has to be very careful in the way he advances this agenda.
John Gong, getting back to President Lula's domestic concerns and part of what you focused on during this visit. He wants to reindustrialize his country, as Einar Tangen pointed out earlier, taking into account the environment as well as the climate crisis. Now, the government calls it NeoIndustrialization, and China, we know, has the combined financial, industrial and technology conditions to cooperate with Brazil in things like electric vehicles, in information technology, 5G, aerospace, biomedicine, semiconductors. Point is there the synergy that exists between these two countries to make something of this?
Oh, absolutely. I think this is about the right time. China is actually going through a period of industrial upgrade or structural upgrade. Some of the industries are actually moving out of China due to the cost economics, due to the various other factors in the Chinese economy. And Brazil being a resource-rich country that needs investment and needs investment, particularly in its infrastructure. And every time we talk about industrialization or reindustrialization, infrastructure is critically important, as we have learned this, this very important lesson in China's own economic development. And this is precisely the areas where Chinese companies have been very good at. We've been building infrastructures all around the world. Certainly, it's a good thing to see that finally, Brazil and China are going to sign a Belt and Road bilateral agreement. What it means is that there will be a lot of investment from China, a lot of companies from China that are going to build, port facilities, electric grids, generation capabilities, electric generation capabilities, and all of these things that are very vital for industrialization, for investment. Now, I also want to chime in on a previous question about Brazilians' proposal to have a sort of a small group of countries to mediate peace in Ukraine. I think this is actually an intriguing idea. The reason is that I think at the present time, the mediating parties need to be really neutral on this war. And if you look at the leading powers, the great powers of the world, the entire West are on the Ukrainian side. But the countries like China, Brazil, to some extent, I would even say Turkey, Indonesia. These are the countries that have been very much on a neutral stance at this point.
Right.
And they have all been expressing interest or at least try to mediate some kind of a peace. Together with the rest of the BRIC countries and together with a few countries in Europe, Turkey, for example, and also important players in the emerging market like
right.
Saudis and also Indonesia. That actually creates a strong political force that, first of all, in a capability to entitled to mediating peace, in my view, between the two sides, and also in terms of exerting a lot of political pressure on Moscow as well.
Yeah.
So I think it's actually a very good idea. I actually delivered a talk at the Volnai Forum a few weeks ago.
Right,
actually,
right.
I was proposing an idea of a coalition of the unwilling. That means that the neutral countries need to get together and promote peace in Ukraine.
Well, we'll see if that gains any traction. Gustavo, I want to get to one other issue very quickly. I've only got about 40 seconds. But, you were talking earlier on about some of the rhetoric that President Lula used and how that might be interpreted in the West, in the United States particularly. He made a very pointed visit to Huawei. To its innovation center, which is basically its research and development center. We know that Huawei has been the target of the United States and its European allies. They've been trying to isolate Huawei, to try to crush the company. So what kind of message do you think that sent?
Well, within the Workers' Party, there is a sentiment that U.S. rhetoric on Huawei seems rich coming from the U.S. because the members of the Workers' Party have told me these past few weeks, we are old enough to remember that in 2015, we had the NSA scandal where documents showed that the U.S. was spying on Brazilian government officials. So what they say is that even if these claims against Huawei are true, it does not differ that much from what Western powers already do. Right, there's been no evidence of that anyway. Anyway, but we're going to have to leave it there. Time has run out. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching.